Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at a Abzan Revolt deck. So it's very different to the Flicker deck. A lot of you guys mentioned that I wasn't using many Revolt cards in the Flicker deck last time, and that's mostly because since Revolt was the equal tide voted deck, I just made sure that this deck is a lot different to Flicker, and it certainly is, because it doesn't use any Flicker cards to trigger Revolt. It's mostly a sacrifice and getting value out of that kind of thing form of deck. So we're using a lot of clues, a lot of servos, and a lot of sacrifice outlets. So let's have a look at the deck. For those who don't know what Revolt is the newest mechanic from the set, and it says that if a permanent left the battlefield this turn, or on your turn, it depends on the card, then something happens to make your card a lot better. So in the case of Narnum Renegade, it's a 1 green mana 1/2 with Death Touch, and if a permanent left the battlefield this turn, it enters the battlefield with an extra 1/1 counter on it. So for 1 mana you can have yourself a 2/3 Death Touch, which is really good. There's a lot of power in that, and it's a really good way of stalling out your opponent and having a really aggressive start as well. We then have Renegade Map. This is one of the ways that we trigger Revolt. I will constantly call it Renegade, by the way. I don't know why, but I will. So if I call it Renegade from this point on, the mechanic that is, then just know I mean Revolt. So Renegade Map is a 1 mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, and you get to sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. So on turn 2, you can go grab another basic. There's a really nice combo with Renegade Map. Turn 1, you play the Renegade Map, as long as you have black or white mana to cast it anyway. And then on turn 2, it untaps. You play either the black or white mana that you are missing, and you play a Hidden Stockpile. And since you actually sacrifice the map, you trigger Hidden Stockpile the turn it comes out, which gets you your token. And the token you can scry on your turn to trigger Revolt every single turn. So as soon as turn 2, we can have Revolt triggering every single turn. So it's a really cool combo right there. It's also a good mana fixer as well. We are a 3-colored deck, and we're running an extremely low curve. We curve out at 3, and there are only 3 cards that are not 3. So, you know, for the most part, everything is 3 cost. If we look here, it's mostly 3 drops, but the early game as well is really easy to do, so it's pretty sweet. Alright, moving on, we have Fatal Push. This is one of the new removal spells in the format. So for 1 black instant speed, destroy target creature if it has converted mana cost 2 or less. So in the early game, we can just straight up remove a card. However, if we trigger Revolt by having one of our creatures leave the battlefield this turn, maybe we suicide them into an attack to force our opponent to block, or we just sack them with our Hidden Stockpile, then we can destroy a creature if it has converted mana cost 4 or less. So by triggering Revolt, we double the power of Fatal Push. Fatal Push on its own, though, is still pretty good. It gets rid of Sylvan Advocates, it gets rid of Baby Jace. There's a lot of creatures it gets rid of just on its own. But if you trigger Revolt, then you get rid of your Kalatases and all of your lovely 4-drops, European Kierans, that kind of thing. So there is a lot of value in this card. It's only a 2-of because we do have a lot of better removal, so it's not going to be triggered too much, and it is not very good against higher curved decks like Ramp and Eldrazi, that kind of thing. So I didn't want to go all in on Fatal Push, because we are a bit of a grindy deck as well, it should be noted. We play at a really slow speed sometimes, despite the fact that our curve is quite low and we can get an aggressive start. We really want to be just triggering Revolt over several turns before we actually murder our opponent. Next, we have Green Wheel Liberator. So for 1 and a green, you have a 2/1 Elf Warrior. It has Revolt, and when it enters the battlefield, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn. So we can sacrifice a servo from Hidden Stockpile and play this guy out for a 4/3, that kind of thing. We can also do the same trick as I mentioned with Renegade Map to grab the green source and get Green Wheel Liberator down as a 4/3 on turn 2, which is awesome. That is a lot of pressure. That's better than the usual best turn 2 play, which used to be Sylvan Advocate, really, I would say. It was a really annoying play, let's just say that much. So Green Wheel Liberator can get past a Sylvan Advocate, is a lot better than it. We then have Evolutionary Leap, only one off, because we do have a lot of sacrifice outlets. I haven't actually, since I put this card in the deck, I haven't really seen it all that much. Or when I've seen it, it's been a little bit too late. But I know that it does a lot of advantage, because we are a creature-heavy focus deck, and we also really do need this sacrifice a creature. So we'll be sacrificing our servos to reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card, which has Revolt, almost certainly. Put that card into your hand, the rest on the bottom, and then we can cast that Revolt card the turn that it comes down for full value. There's only, I think, one creature that doesn't have Revolt, and oh no, we have Bygone Bishops, and we have Nyssa and Tireless Tracker, and that is literally it as far as non-Revolt cards go, and even they are absolutely fantastic cards to hit off the top anyway, so it's really good. So Evolutionary Leap, if our opponent tries to remove a creature, we sack it in response, we go and get another creature, so we can constantly recycle what we want. We do have a little bit of graveyard recursion as well, so sacking those creatures is not the end of the world. There are ways that we can get them back, though not a great deal, because this isn't a very graveyard-focused deck either. We then have Hidden Stockpile, arguably the best engine for Revolt in the game. It is a white and a black enchantment with Revolt. It says at the beginning of your end step, if a opponent you control left the battlefield this turn, you get to create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact token. So there's some really cool synergies and combos that it has with itself, to be honest, because you can trigger Revolt on its own as long as you have a servo around. So as we mentioned before, you can sack Renegade Map and get this out as soon as turn 2 to get that servo at the end of turn. And at the beginning of your turn, if you actually sacrifice the servo that the stockpile created, you trigger Revolt again, so you get to get that servo back. So even if you get rid of the servo it creates on your turn, it's coming back at the end of turn. So you can swing in with it, sacrifice it, it's going to come back untapped. So you kind of have a vigilant servo token that you can constantly scry with as well. So it's really cool for that. It's also really good as a decent Revolt trigger, because it's only 1 mana to trigger it, essentially. And most of the time, you're going to have a servo around to actually sacrifice. Excuse me. Next, we have Resourceful Return. This is our graveyard recursion. It's not too much of it. We're only running 3 copies, but it's for those occasions where there might be a creature in our graveyard that we really might want to get at some point. Things like our Renegade Rally, for example. It's really good with this card. I'll get to that in a bit. But Resourceful Return, 1 and a black, sorcery speed, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. If you control an artifact, you get to draw a card. So we get to return absolutely any creature we want. Might be a Greenwheel Liberator, might be, not a Fatal Push, might be a Narnum Renegade, that kind of thing. And if we control an artifact, which we have Hidden Stockpile to create servos, we have Bygone Bishop to create clue tokens, as well as Tireless Tracker to do that. There's a very good chance that we actually have an artifact in play. So this is actually a 2 mana, return a creature, draw a card, 9 times out of 10. As long as you do it in the right order. I am a bit of a criminal when it comes to doing the things in the wrong order, so there is the occasion when I'll do it, but hopefully not. Hopefully you don't get to see me do it in the videos. I don't think I've done it so far, but I'm sure you guys will let me know if I did. Alright, moving on, we've got Bygone Bishop, so for 2 and a white, 3 converted mana cost total, we get a 2/3 flyer, Spirit. Whenever you cast a creature spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, you get to investigate. So, essentially, as I've mentioned, we've got a very low curve. Every single creature in our deck will trigger Bygone Bishop, without fail, without exception. All of our creatures are 3 or less. So, for every single creature we play into Bygone Bishop, we get a clue token. And a clue token is essentially an artifact that sits on the side of the battlefield, and you can pay 2 to sacrifice it and draw a card. Sacrificing a clue is also a great way to trigger Revolt as well. So Bygone Bishop is actually a Revolt enabler in itself. We get to sack, draw, and play some of our 3 drops to use their abilities. So it's really good if you can get this guy out. Next we... Oh, and also, clue tokens is also an artifact, so a Resourceful Return also triggers it. Next we have Solemn Recruit, so for 1 and 2 white, a 2/2 with double strike, with Revolt as well, that says at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, put a 1/1 counter on Solemn Recruit. So this can get out of hand very fast. soon as turn 3, you've got 4 power on the board. Turn 4, maybe sack an Evolving Wilds, hit for 4, and then it gets a counter, and suddenly you're hitting for 6. There is a lot of damage, and this can get even the biggest creatures in the format to stop attacking you. We also, of course, have our Nanum Renegade with Death Touch to do that for us as well, which is why we're such a grindy deck, because we actually have our little creatures eventually become very hard to get rid of and get through, so it's very off-putting for our opponent to attack into us, which gives us a lot of time to set up our board. And our board state constantly grows as well. Even if you wipe our board, it's coming back in a turn or two anyway, just the same as it used to be. So Solemn Recruit is really good for that. I've just remembered that I haven't added a card that I mentioned. It's going to be something like that. I haven't added a card that I mentioned in one of the matches, or at least I think I did anyway. Rogue's Passage. I'm going to get rid of Plains. Sure, why not? Because Rogue's Passage will allow us to make creatures unblockable, and as you can guess, with a Solemn Recruit, making your Solemn Recruit unblockable when it's got like 4 or 5 counters on it is probably just going to be game on its own. I don't want to put too many Rogue's Passages in, because we are a 3-coloured deck, so hitting colourless lands can be a bit of a pain in the arse. So I only really want 1. But it's for those occasions when we have a clogged up board and we just really need to get through that final little bit of damage. It doesn't happen as often as you might think. We can usually grind our way through that kind of stuff, but having a Rogue's Passage just means that we don't have to do that necessarily. Next we have Deadeye Harpooner. So for 2 and a white, we have a 2/2. When Deadeye Harpooner enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, then you get to destroy target tapped creature an opponent controls. So we get to, essentially, this is our removal spell with an added bonus of having a 2/2 on top of it. So it's pretty sweet. So if our opponent attacks in with one of their big creatures, as long as it doesn't have vigilance or indestructible, it's going to die the turn after. And we can pay as little as absolutely nothing to trigger Revolt in order to do this. So it's a 3-mana removal spell, as long as our opponent taps out. If they tap their Baby Jace or something like that at the wrong time, we can play this on our turn and kill it. So there's a lot of uses there. Next we have Vengeful Rebel. Yet again, this is another bit of removal as well as a creature on top. 2 and a black for a Aetherborn warrior creature with Revolt. When Vengeful Rebel enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-3. That also kills a lot of creatures in the format. There are a few that it actually doesn't hit. A lot of Eldrazi, of course. It does hit Sylvan Advocates, that kind of thing. All of the creature planeswalkers, I believe it hits. Yes, it does. Absolutely every single creature planeswalker it will kill, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of scenarios where Vengeful Rebel can do a lot of work. So it's pretty sweet. We're running 3 copies of that because it is a 3/2 and there's a lot of pressure to be put on with 3 power. We then have Nyssa Vastwood Seer, speaking of creature planeswalkers. So for 2 and a green, we have a 2/2 legendary creature, Elf Scout. When Nyssa Vastwood Seer enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. You may notice we're running 22 lands. That is a very low amount to run, but not so low as to hurt us too much. 23 might be nice, but I feel like we have a lot of ways of grabbing lands with our Renegade maps, you know, with our Nissas, Tireless Trackers to draw us into lands, that kind of thing. So 22 seems like the sweet spot for me, and it really works out. I can still quite easily flip Nyssa as well, because Nyssa does need 7 or more lands to transform into a Planeswalker side. It's not out of the question. Our games go on quite long, so Nyssa is perfectly capable of flipping. And she comes back as a 3 loyalty planeswalker. She has a +1 ability to reveal the top card of your library. If it is a land, you put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, you put it into your hand. So the first part of this ability, if you hit a land, you get to ramp. So we get to hit another land off the top. If it's an Evolving Wilds, we can crack it to trigger Revolt. If it is just a normal land, then it just ramps as pure and simple. And if it is not, then it's card advantage. It gets us our Revolt cards as well. Her -2 ability is her way of protecting herself, so for -2, put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashaya, the Awoken World, onto the battlefield. So 4/4 is nothing to turn your nose up at. It will block most things and keep us safe. Of course, she can't block flyers, So you've got to keep that in mind before you flip the Nyssa. You've got to make sure that you play your 7th land when you need to play your 7th land, because if you play it into a lot of flyers, she's going to flip, and then she's going to be a perfect target for spirits and things like that. But her ultimate for -7, not managed to do it yet in this deck, but it is easily possible. Untap up to 6 target lands, they become 6/6 elemental creatures, and they are still lands. So that is 6 6/6s, which is more than 20 damage, which is what your life total is when you begin the game. So for the most part, it's going to be a lethal amount, and if it's not, then there's going to be a lot of chump blocking on your opponent's side, and the next attack is likely going to be the lethal one. And they may not necessarily be 6/6s, and I'll get to a reason why that might be later on. Tireless Tracker. So for 2 and a green, creature, human, scout. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to investigate. So we get to create a clue token, and we can sack that clue token to draw a card and trigger Revolt. When you do sacrifice a clue, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. So yet again, small creature, capable of getting very big, generates card advantage, triggers Revolt. Absolutely key card in this deck if you can get it out there and keep it around. Does so much work that it is an auto-include, in my personal opinion, if you're going for more of the sacrificed focused Revolt deck anyway. There is a flicker version of it, which is similar to the Bant one that we played last week, but this one's very sacrifice focused, so if you're going that way, Tireless Tracker is awesome. Renegade Rally, probably one of my favourite cards in the deck. It's not because it particularly does anything stupidly overpowered, but it is such a good value creature for the cost. So for 1, a green and a white, a 3/2 human warrior with Revolt, and when Renegade Rallier enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, you get to return a permanent card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, permanents with mana cost 2 or less. Let's have a look what we've got. Well, we've got Hidden Stockpile. If they got rid of our Revolt trigger, then we can get that back. There's also Evolutionary Leap, so we can start sacrificing creatures again. We can get Liberator back if we've triggered Revolt, which we already have by playing the Renegade Rallier. We can get a Liberator back as a 4/3 on the same turn. This does enter the battlefield, of course. It doesn't go into your hand, as you can see. And we can also get Renegade Map to trigger Revolt next turn, and a Narnam Renegade in order to have a death-touching creature to stop our opponent. Alternatively, we can also grab a land and even an Evolving Wilds. And Evolving Wilds allows us to thin out our deck, and we get to sacrifice it on the turn after if we choose to do so, to trigger Revolt again. So there is so much for Renegade Rallier to hit, and we can do this as soon as turn 3 with our little Renegade map trick. So turn 3, untapped Renegade map, we sacrifice it, grab the land that we need to finish off the colours that we need for the Rallier. Already triggered Rally at that point, so we play him for a 3/2 for 3, and we can even grab the map back if we've got nothing left in our graveyard. So there's always something for Renegade Rallier to trigger, almost 9 times out of 10 at least anyway. And he's just such a good value creature that he's amazing. I would not run him in any Revolt deck if you're in these colours anyway. Next we have Anguished Unmaking. So for 1, a white and a black, instant speed, exile target non-land permanent, and you lose 3 life. So this is our remove absolutely anything card. If we're playing against Tutelage, then this is the card that we're hunting for. We get to exile Sphinx's Tutelage. If our opponent's just Ulamogged us, then we get to exile that off the board. And anything that might be a little bit too nasty, like a flyer we can't block, that's gone as well. Unfortunately, we can only run 2 copies because it is a rare, but being able to destroy whatever non-land permanent we want is pretty sweet. It's also Planeswalkers as well, so if we get against Super Friends, I'd be so glad to have this in my hand. So if they think they're about to ultimate their Planeswalker, we just get it off the field, that kind of thing. Next, we're on to the major game winners. These are the Windmore cards, and the main reason why this deck can be so grindy and pull out quite easily in the later game. So Call for Unity is a 3 and 2 white enchantment and says Revolt. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, you get to put a Unity counter on Call for Unity. And creatures you control get +1/+1 for each unity counter on call for unity. Now, if you watched the Flicker deck last week, I did run a single copy of this, and we did get to see it work in action. But in this deck, it works so much better. It is so much more suited for this style of deck. So we can turn our 1-drops into massive creatures. So if we've actually triggered Revolt on the turn, we've got a 2/3, and at the end step, it becomes a 3/4, a 5/6, a 7/8, that kind of thing. Eventually, when we grind out our opponent and swing in for victory, most of our creatures are 1-drop 7/8s, that kind of thing. So as long as Call for Unity is around, we can get our creatures very big and stop our opponent from attacking through with their bigger creatures. So we can even block some decent Eldrazi as long as they're not exiling 20 cards off the top of our library, that kind of thing. So our Renegade Rallyer can block a Kozilek, for example. Well, you need a Menace card, an extra blocker, but you get what I mean. So Call for Unity, absolutely awesome. Kind of a bit of a role reversal compared to our Flicker deck. We're actually only running 1 Aid from the Cowl in this deck as opposed to 2 from our Flicker deck, because we ran 1 in the Flicker deck in the last one. But it's mostly because this one's just kind of, it is amazing, of course, but Call for Unity is just so much better in this deck when we've got a lot of servos around and stuff like that. So Aid from the Cowl is a 3 and 2 green enchantment. It has Revolt. It says at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, you get to reveal the top card of your library. If it is a permanent card, then you get to put it on the battlefield, which should hopefully trigger Revolt, depending on what state you're currently in. Otherwise, you may put it on the bottom of your library. So when I say what state you're in, essentially, Revolt is already triggered, and the only times that Revolt will trigger again off of some creature on the battlefield is if it says when it enters the battlefield, if a permanent left this turn. Because, of course, we do have a few that say left on the end step, at the beginning of your end step, and this triggers on the end step, so the time for it to trigger has passed. We do also, of course, have non-Revolt cards and lands to hit as well, so it can hit a lot of other stuff. If we do end up hitting something like... If we do end up hitting something like an Anguished Unmaking, which is obviously not a permanent, so it would not go onto the battlefield, we can choose to either scry it to the top or bottom as well. So it's pretty sweet. There's always value to be outcome from Aid from the Cowl, whether or not it takes anything off the top of your library or not. So that's essentially the deck. Let's go on to the mana. As I spoke about earlier, we are running 22 lands. It's because our curve is very low, and we do have a lot of ways to grab lands as well. It's really easy for this deck to get all 3 colours as soon as turn 3, in fact, so you got nothing to worry about there. You do occasionally get mana screwed, of course, but that just comes with most decks and variants, and 22 lands does that from time to time. But running any more than this, I expect that you probably end up getting flooded, and you don't really want to draw into too many cards. So we are running 3 plains, 3 swamps, and 3 forests. So we have plenty of basics to grab. Basics are very good because we have ourselves Evolving Wilds that can grab them, that kind of thing. And also Nyssa grabs basics as well. So we need those around. And they're obviously untapped as well. Moving on, we have Hissing Quagmire. So this is a green-black tapped manland. And by manland, I mean that you can pay 1 a black and a green to make Hissing Quagmire a 2/2 black and green elemental creature token with Death Touch until the end of the turn. And it is still a land. So if our opponent wipes our board, and maybe we have a Call for Unity on the field with a couple of counters on it, we can, in response on our next turn, swing in with our Hissing Quagmire that does not die to a board wipe, that can be either a 2/2, or it can be a 2/2 plus the number of Unity counters on Call for Unity. So it's kind of like having a Sylvan Advocate around if you've got a Call for Unity. So in the later game, we'll likely see these guys not be the cost that they actually are. So this one also comes with Death Touch as well, so I can use it as a deterrent to slow my opponent down and discourage them from attacking in if they see that I have the mana open to cast and block with it. We then have Shambling Vents. This is the white-black manland. And for 1 a white and a black, Shambling Vent becomes a 2/3 white and black elemental creature with lifelink until the end of the turn. So it's essentially the same thing as Hissing Quagmire, except for it's got 1 extra toughness and lifelink instead of Death Touch. And yet again, if we have Call for Unity, this 2/3 is not a 2/3, it's probably a lot more than that. So it's pretty sweet for that. And it also helps us fix our mana as well, because it's very important that we fix our mana. We don't have too many tap lands. In fact, I believe these are really the only ones, unless you count Evolving Wilds as one, which technically it kind of is. But for the most part, those are our only tap lands. We then have Woodland Cemetery. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. So we don't have the usual... oops, I'm in colourless. Hang on. We don't have the usual special lands, these ones that have the land types in them, because we don't actually have them in Abzan. It's an alternative form. We obviously do have Plains Forest, which maybe we want to put in, but we are going quite low on the curve as well, so these are likely going to be all tap lands. So we don't really want that many tap lands, because we want our turn 1 plays as soon as possible. So the reason I'm not playing them is for that exact reason. There's just too much chance for them to come into play tapped. So we want to get off to a great start. So we're using Woodland Cemeteries instead. Comes into play tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest, which is why we're running so many basics. We have the same as well for Isolated Chapel. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a plains or a swamp. Next we have Rogue's Passage. You watched me add this in. I did mean to put it in earlier and I just forgot before I started recording, so that's the only reason. Only running 1 because it is a colourless mana source. It is the only one in our deck, but because we're running 3 different colours and a lot of our cards take about 2 colours as well as doubles, it's a very bad idea to run too many colourless lands. So we're only going to run 1. It's not going to come in handy too often because for a lot of the situations that we'll be in, unless we've got Call for Unity or a really big Solemn Recruit, most of our creatures aren't worth spending 4 mana to make unblockable if they're just 2/2s, for example. So we only want to run 1 for the off chance that we draw it and it becomes useful, and we don't want to run more than that because colourless lands can be very annoying, especially in 3+ coloured decks. Finally, we have Evolving Wilds. So Evolving Wilds is a land that you get to sacrifice, search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle your library. So Evolving Wilds, great way of triggering Revolt. Evolving Wilds leaves the battlefield to search you for a basic land, so you're not losing a land, but you are triggering Revolt for free. So if you can get this in use, then you're pretty sweet and good to go. We can use our Rallier as well to grab an Evolving Wilds, which we can use to thin out our deck and ramp as well. So there might likely be an Evolving Wilds in the graveyard when the Rallier enters the battlefield, so we can use Rallier as a way of ramping up and getting the lands that we need. Alright guys, that is going to do it for the deck tech. If you like the look of the deck and haven't already, then be sure to check out the matches. There will be a link to it at the end of the video for you to check out. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the look of the deck, as well as subscribe for more Magic Duels content. We're going to be doing it mostly from Friday to Sunday, but since the Aether Revolt release is out, then we're doing a lot more releases. I'll probably still be doing a Friday to Sunday, so this is going to be a very busy Magic week for you guys. So I hope you enjoy the content that I'll be putting out, because there will be a deck on Friday as well, hopefully, if I have the time anyway. So we'll see. Anyway guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the matches. See you there.